I've got 30 minutes to tell you everything I've seen as a mistake in manure application. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but hopefully you'll stay awake during a good chunk of it. Or it could be titled, How to Keep Out of Hot, Dirty Water. Also, many of these same mistakes apply to use of chemical fertilizers or biosolids. So many of you can probably take some tips of what we should be doing or not doing. I'll start with one of the things that we see quite frequently and we get a little ouchy about, and the presenter earlier did a real good job saying that we require soil tests. That's always a good beginning, and probably one of the most frequent mistakes is not knowing what you're applying to. If you don't have a soil test, you're guessing. Why? Well, the excuse, we're only put on crop removal. I've seen crop removal go on to a soil test that I still have in my desk of 5,000 parts per million. You know how much 5,000 parts per million would take to get rid of? Forever. It would long past their life. Unfortunately, it doesn't take that long, because we've seen soil tests that were at one particular problem egg farm were 2,600 parts per million on 6,000 acres. They're now at 1,200 parts per million 15 years later. They didn't take that many crops off. There wasn't any manure applied. But I'll give you one guess where it probably went. No, not Lake Erie in this case. It went to High River. But yeah, when it gets that high, your chances of movement's a lot higher. So we want to see a soil test to show that that's agronomically needed and used. If the soil tests are above agronomic levels, it's hard to justify, and it makes both environmental and economic sense to find a place where it's better used. So that's one of the mistakes we see frequently. The other is not having a manure sample. And again, earlier the presenter, one of the CLMs talked about that. Having a manure sample is one thing, having a representative sample is another. And earlier they talked about the number of manure samples that they'd collected over the years. And that's good, because one manure sample is about like one soil sample. It's worth what it is. If you have a history, then you know more and can use that information better. Every manure is different. It agitates differently. You heard discussions also this morning about the use of additives. And the different additives do change the characteristics of that manure. Also, if you're applying an unagitated manure sample, maybe you ought to have an unagitated manure, maybe you ought to have a sample of that so you know what's being applied if you're taking the top off of a storage structure or a pit. So manure sampling, yeah, we only require one a year, but I would recommend you take many more samples than that to use that the most economically as possible. One a year for every structure that you're applying from is the minimum. Agitation of some of these structures gets to be very interesting. I was talking with a consultant yesterday, and they're going to put a permanent agitation barge on one of the facilities they're designing to be able to agitate that properly to get that manure removed. So every type of manure structure is different. I will tell you that one of the mistakes we had, we inherited a medium facility. A soil and water district many years ago got fed up. This swine facility had some problems, and they had multiple complaints and multiple violations and couldn't seem to get it right, so they referred it to us for a permit. The first thing we did was we closed that facility down and ordered them not to populate it again until it was brought up to spec. Any guesses of what the problems were? He had a manure pit that it was an 8-foot pit that were 4 foot of solids in the bottom of it, and it was collecting rainwater in addition to manure. Rainwater tended to fill up that pit very quickly, and it kept running out of storage in about 30, 40 days instead of 6 months to a year like it should be. So making sure your facilities are cleaned out and agitated and you got good samples is another issue. If you don't have a good test, everything else will be junk. Both soil test and manure test. You're either going to underestimate the nutrients needed for the crop and have yield reductions or losses, or you could easily result in an over-application violation. We had cases where we had written up in inspections where they were assuming a manure sample analysis, and when they got the actual results, they were putting on 500 pounds of P2O5 per application per acre. The manure was a little thick. They knew it was thick, but they didn't think the analysis would come back that much. We've had manure samples of lagoons that they're pumping the sediment out of the lagoon where they've had, let me get it right, 200 pounds of phosphorus per 1,000 gallons. From that sludge in the bottom of the lagoon that had been there for 20 years. Now you figure out how you apply 1,000 gallons per acre of a liquid to keep under that 250 pound maximum application limit per year. Take time to look at what might cause changes in what you are applying. That might be more rainfall than usual. It might be a drought. It might be the fact that the pit wasn't agitated properly, so you're getting 2 or 3 years manure in one application by agitating it properly. Look at, like I said, past tests. Look at long-term averages to get a better idea. And again, always test the manure that you are applying. If you're applying out of different structures or you're applying without agitation, still get those samples so you know what's being applied. Many times misapplications and spills are due to not properly calculating the application rates. Doing the nutrient calculations is critical. Assuming is not a real good thing. That's one of the reasons we have sheets to record what's being applied that include the manure test, the soil test, the pounds of N, P, and K that are being applied. And we should always be using the Tri-State Fertility Guide for the application rates. I know you can apply up to 150 parts per million using some of these phosphorus assessment limitations, but we don't want to be using those on a regular basis. We use those where there's been a previous buildup, but any facility we're working on a permit needs to balance the livestock numbers, the manure produced, and the cropland acres, or they need to figure on getting more acres or distributing manure to where it can be properly used at agronomic levels. You can do those calculations by hand. They aren't that hard. Or you can use quite a number of different programs to do it on the computer. This is one that one of my engineers, Patrick Bailey, put out, and it's available if you want it. Send us an email. But basically it has all the information to prevent you from making mistakes. It lists the parts per million or pounds per acre. It lists the Bray P1 or the Malick It does the conversions automatically. It lists the soil test levels, and it lists all the crops and the yields, and you can plug in up to 5 different crops, and then it gives you how many nutrients those planned yields and crops need, and also you plug in a manure test, and it'll tell you how much you're applying. You can change the rates. It'll red flag if you're above the nitrogen or phosphorus limits, and then it'll tell you how many other nutrients might be needed by additional chemical fertilizer, since manure is not a perfect nutrient source for everything. It has on there the buildup, the maintenance, and the drawdown levels that are in the Tri-State Fertility Guide. So it does basically give you everything you need for the crops and rotations for application rates. A lot of the times, your limits are the nitrogen needs for the next crop, the phosphorus needs for the crop rotation based on the soil test, or for the liquid manure, it might be the available water holding capacity of the soil at the time of application. So there's a lot of different factors that affect the application of manure. Any questions on, if somebody's interested, the contact information's on the bottom, on the last slide, and just send us an email and we can send you this. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and the instructions go with it as far as that, and quite a few people have said they use it and like it. I mentioned the available water holding capacity. A lot of our spills, our discharges, are because the soil cannot hold on to what's being applied. The available water holding capacity at the time of application is one of the limits for liquid manure that has to be looked at very strictly. There are charts. This is in the USDA NRCS 590, and based on the type of soil, whether it's a sand or a loamy sand or a silt loam or clay, it tells you how much capacity that soil has to hold on to additional water. And it gets down pretty quickly to around that 5,000 to 7,000 gallons. So if your soil has had some moisture in it, you may not be able to put on a ½ inch. But you need to understand what those limits are. That's probably one of the most frequent things that causes surface runoff or causes movement to tile. Some of these soils, when they're very dry, could hold up to 40,000 gallons. But if it's tiled, you're only allowed 13,000. So ½ inch or 13,000 gallons is the top limit for almost all soils in Ohio because of subsurface drainage. One of the other things that gets people in trouble is setbacks. Staying away from houses, wells, roads, streams, and even waterways when you're applying is critical. Knowing those setbacks and following them is probably one of the most important things to keep from having discharge. The standards require 35 feet of permanent vegetation or 100 feet of crop residue for surface applications. Look at points of potential discharge. These are minimums. There are factors in the field that can increase the likelihood that that setback may not stop movement of manure. If you're going downhill and crossing that water pattern, chances are you're going to increase the chance of movement and nutrient concentration. Wheel tracks, compaction, the amount and type of residue are critical to minimizing movement of that manure. Incorporation of some type is often one way of getting that 100-foot setback to be less important. This chart lists some of the setbacks that are required by U.S. EPA and our rules and regulations. Springs, 300 feet. Bedrock, 3 feet from bedrock. Wells, 300 feet. Surface waters of the state, it has 300 or 35 feet and 100. 300s from staging areas and stockpiles. So these are all in the information. It's in USDA NRCS Nutrient Management Standard 590. It's in our rules. Pay attention to those setbacks. Anytime you're closer on a surface application, it can be a violation. Nothing hides anymore. I don't know if you can see that, but every one of these turns is probably doubling the rate and is too close to surface water. You can see where they went straight across that surface, that grass waterway. You don't hide any more manure application. You never did, but it's even harder to hide it today. One of the things that's come up recently is what is incorporation? Some applicators have said, well, I'm incorporating. See, I ran that tillage tool through there. It poked holes in the soil. Injection and incorporation means placement and mixing with the soil. If there's no soil disturbance, they didn't even move the residue, you can't really call it incorporation. Not saying that that's bad. That'll break up the cracks and some of the preferential flow pathways, but it's not mixing the manure with the soil. If it rains on this and the manure's on top, the likelihood of movement of that nutrient is a lot greater than if it's mixed in with the soil. That manure, same thing if it's commercial fertilizer, is very high in soluble phosphorus. Commercial fertilizer is treated to be soluble. Manure is naturally very soluble. If water runs off, it will carry that solution. If it's mixed in with the soil, it binds with the soil more rapidly and reduces the chance for off-site movement. If you're doing this to reduce a setback, run another tillage tool in that area to count or to make it truly incorporated. I don't want to lose surface application as a means, because in a lot of cases, whether it's on growing crops or whether it's on pastures or instances where there's cover crops, there are benefits from not tearing up the soil structure. But if it's on top, you have to understand there's chance of movement. What about the condition of the soil at application? How important is that? It's probably not as important on dry poultry manure or a dry packed beef operation or separated solids out of a dairy to have pathways like that. But how about a whole field of cracks? A liquid will find those cracks and move through it. You have an opportunity to see some of the edge of field research from Dr. Kevin King tomorrow, and he'll show you that some of his edge of field monitoring systems have no surface runoff. It all goes through the tile. So if you're applying a liquid manure to this, and not breaking those cracks up, there's where it goes. And it gets there very quickly. I remember one of the hog producers that was applying out of his true swine lagoon, and before he could walk to the outlet where he had applied at proper rates, proper soil conditions, it was running out the tile. Excuse me. It's very critical to understand those pathways and disrupt them, and to monitor those drainage systems. Know where those outlets are at. We've had countless fish kills, countless water pollutions, violations, penalties for fish from applications they did not know there were tile in the field. That's not necessarily an excuse that will fly. So it's critical to know what you're applying to, where the tile are, to monitor and observe those tile inlets before, during, and after application. One of the penalties we had was the dairy hired a applicator. The applicator applied manure, did everything fine. They monitored the tile before and during application. A thunderstorm came up, and they didn't look at the tile after the rain. 5 miles later, and numerous fish, they found out that maybe they should have blocked that tile off or looked at it. Nobody's going to be perfect. There's always going to be accidents. The point is you need to think about what mistakes could occur and try to anticipate it and try to prevent them from reoccurring. Repair any broken tile or blowholes. Look at the fields. Follow the recommended setbacks from surface inlets. Basically, use some common sense. It's a lot easier to stay away from a surface inlet or to fix a broken tile than try to capture everything running down the stream later. More and more, if the fields are being used for liquid manure application, we're encouraging that they look at some type of water control structures on those outlets if manure is being used on a regular occasion. Also, if they're designed properly in a lot of fields, they can get some benefit from some sub-irrigation from it, as well as potentially restricting or limiting a discharge from a manure application. Even if you're using commercial fertilizer or no manure, these structures can reduce nitrate movement to streams if they're used properly, and phosphorus discharges also. Be prepared. Have some means of closing off those drainage systems, whether it's a water control structure, a drain plug, a backhoe that can cut the tile. Probably half of the valid complaints that we have are discharges from a drainage system. They weren't anticipating it. They didn't calculate the water holding capacity right. They didn't calibrate their application equipment, or were putting on more than they thought they were. Liquid manure applied to subsurface drain fields. We talked a little bit about using some type of tillage to disrupt those macropores, but leaving some residue on the surface to minimize erosion. It may mean that you have to leave a little further setback from the stream, but a lot of times having that residue and breaking up those pores can make that soil absorb the liquid a lot better. One of the things that's not thought about in a lot of cases is when they're drag lining the turns apply 2 times as much as the regular application. If those turns are close to a setback, not only do they look bad, but they give the opportunity for the soil not to absorb enough liquid and to have nutrient movement. There's new technology that will reduce the pressure or temporarily shut off, and you heard Glenn talk about cycling it back into a tank and putting it back to the applicator after the turn's done. There are different ways that you can address that, but be aware of it. Take it into account. It has caused problems and complaints and violations and penalties. Probably one of the worst case situations is there was a washout in the field and they kept wanting to go round that washout with a drag line and turn. So every pass, instead of just doubling the turn, they were applying on every end piece 3 or 4 times. And they had a discharge and a fish kill, and it got expensive. Surface movement and ponding. Again, watch that available water holding capacity. Take into account even small surface flow patterns. Monitor after application. If you see manure on the surface that's ponding and not soaking in, you better do something to get it worked into the ground. Do something to try to get that soil to absorb it. A lot of applicators will work the ends before they apply to help get that soil to absorb the extra liquid. In some cases, it's too wet, you can't do anything. Put something to block that flow, to soak it up. The goal would be not to let it get to that point, to recognize you've got a problem before it gets there, because that's hard to stop. It's kind of like the finger in the dam. You're not going to be able to hold that back for the amount of time it is required to soak in. Frozen snow covered. The only thing I've got to say about that is don't do it. I don't care whether you're in the Western Lake Erie Basin or not, you shouldn't be applying manure on frozen snow covered ground. The data, the research, everything else shows nutrient movements. It does not soak into the soil if that ground's frozen and snow covered. Permitted farms have not been allowed to apply on frozen snow covered since about 2006. If you have an emergency or have questions, call us. We'll look at it. We'll look for alternatives. We'll look for acceptable sites. There still are provisions to be able to do it, but there's limitations on the amount, the area, the amount of residue, cover crops, the slope, and it's still not encouraged except in an emergency. If you're a smaller facility, you better be planning alternatives that allow you to store the manure and not put it out there on frozen ground. Records are or can be a lifesaver. One of those records is understanding what the predictions are for rainfall. NOAA has a graphic weather data on their web pages, and you can look at it and see what the prediction, percentage, and amount of rainfall predicted is. I encourage you to copy those off. You saw where this morning where the custom applicators are required to. We inspect that. And there are application record sheets that I mentioned where they have drawings of the fields. They have all of the information on the type, the date, the type of incorporation, whether it's incorporated in the manure equipment, basically all the information that's needed, application rates, quantities, problems or comments, everything on that sheet is for that field, for that application occurrence, just to protect you in case something goes wrong. We've used these to defend many farmers, especially the weather prediction and the application rates showing they followed everything. It was more or less an act of God, something that was not, they did everything to their best of ability. And we prevented fish kill penalties. We prevented basically citations and fines by having good records. Not having records, well, you're kind of out there on your own.
for Terry Messer, who slipped on some ice back in December and had to have shoulder surgery as a result. But Frances is still just as good as Terry. She's just going to do it in a different way. So we've got 3 speakers this afternoon after this for the break that we just had. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Frances and we'll see how it works. You got her on?
Is it on?
Is it on?
Yep. Speak up a little.
All right, gang.
All right, gang.
This is not my
This
forte.
is not my
but,
forte, but
we're going to trudge through this. But before I do get started, since it's the afternoon, I do have a good joke for you. At least I think it's a good one. Anybody have one of those Alexa toys at home? Anybody know what I'm talking about? A little thing that you can talk to and she talks back to you. Well, I have one. Well, I have one at home, and I ask her, tell me a joke every day. So she tells me a joke every day. So one day, it's being a little ornery, and I said, Alexa, tell me a dirty joke. She's what says, what's brown and sounds like a bell? Dung. All right, as some of you know, I do work over in the Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed over on the western side of the state, and we write a lot of nutrient management plans on that side of the state. We write a lot of CNMPs, and some of the things that we've learned over the last couple of years, writing those plans are some very important inputs to make those plans decent as a product for the farmer, and trying to balance the nutrients, because we do have a lot of manure over there with commercial fertilizer has been quite a challenge. Trying to understand the different types of fertilizer and the application rates and timing has also been a challenge. Pairing that with the seasons that manure application goes out. So one of the biggest things when we started working in that distressed watershed is we didn't have very many soil tests. And some of the soil tests, the majority of them coming in were pretty spotty and not very accurate. So we're a couple years into this. We've done quite a bit of training to get good soil samples so that we can have some good input going into figuring out the soil nutrient needs. The other part of that was knowing the recommended soil test level ranges. We have very high soil tests over there, and so we're trying to figure out, how much manure can we continue to put out there, trying to figure out the crop removal rates. We have some guys saying, I pull my soil test down so fast that I keep having to put nutrients out there. So knowing removal rates for potassium and phosphorus, and then also understanding the drawdown of phosphorus. How much historical phosphorus do we have in the soils, and how long is that going to take to draw that down to what we would consider a needed or critical maintenance level. Knowing your manure and analysis, I'm going to show a couple slides here in a little bit. I'd never heard of taking a manure analysis until a couple years ago. We didn't really see much of a need in it. And now it has shown why it's very important. Part of that goes back to what the animals are being fed in the diets. Depending on what the animals are being fed, that'll drastically change the manure analysis. And then also looking at applying nutrients accordingly. So one thing that we learned quite a bit, even the folks in the offices that are trying to help with farmers coming in, is understanding soil test reports. On a normal basis, we have about 6 different labs that we're dealing with, and each one of them have a different reporting method. So trying to figure out how those soil tests are coming in, what the soil test says, and what it means. There is a fact sheet that OSU has put together. It's a 2-page fact sheet. It's nice. It's real simple to read through. Basically explains where your soil test, how to interpret reading a report. The two most common mistakes in our staff that deals with this every day, we still struggle with trying to figure out which way the reporting methods are used. Is the soil extraction type, whether it's in grade P1 or Malic 3, and then the soil test units reported in pounds per acre, parts per million. There is some conversions that you need to use based on depending on how the soil test is coming back. So our biggest problems is recognizing whether it's in parts per million or pounds per acre, and there's a simple math multiply by 2 to get that. But looking at soil test reports, we had a lot of guys that thinking, hey, our soils are okay. They were reading them in parts per million. Right away, when you start doubling those, their 100 part per million soil test is now 200. So the other thing that you guys have heard 5 times over today is utilizing the Tri-State Fertility Guide. Obviously, that's what our recommendations are for the state of Ohio. It's the best thing that we have to take a look at that. It does account for your planned crop, your yield goals, and your current soil test. So you can Google that. It is online. It's very easy to read through. It's not very long, and it's specific to what crop you're putting out. So in the Tri-State Fertilizer Guide, there is a fertilizer range recommendation. The soil test level below this critical level, basically if your soil tests are in there, if you apply manure or nutrients, you're probably going to see a yield boost in that, up until you get to the critical level. There's times when I've seen just putting a little bit of fertilizer out there, they're just so low that the crops have an immediate response. And then you have the maintenance range. That's right in the middle. And the critical level varies between crops, and that's one thing in our area. We do a lot of alfalfa, and we do quite a bit of wheat also for bedding. Some areas that are only using corn and beans, your maintenance ranges are going to be a little bit different. They have to be higher to account for the cold weather for those crops that are growing through the wintertime. So alfalfa and wheat through the wintertime, they're going to utilize that phosphorus more. There is no yield response expected when you're going to fertilize above that critical level. But the question always comes into play, why is that maintenance range so wide? Why is there a big area? Well, it's basically a safety factor. You're looking at the maintenance plateau safeguards against sampling or analytical variation. So if you have some areas that are making that soil test go off a little bit, just for security factor, that's why that maintenance range is so wide. So when we look at the phosphate recommendations coming out of the Tri-State, again, you need to really pay attention. Are you reading in the parts per million column or the pounds per acre of soil test? It gives you both. You just have to know how to read your soil test. So we go back to the maintenance ranges for corn, silage, corn and beans is 30 to 60 pounds per acre. Wheat and alfalfa is 50 to 80 pounds per acre. So in the Tri-State removal rates, we're looking at using the average yield for phosphorus and potassium once the critical soil level is achieved. So once you've met that minimum requirement on the soil test, we need to hold away from using the yield goals, because typically in a 10-year time frame, we're probably going to have a dry year. If we don't have a good crop, that's not going to utilize the nutrients that are there. They're going to be left over. So we really need to be looking at the average yields during those time frames to utilize and project how much you're going to be removing. So it's real simple. You take your average yield goal and you multiply it by the bushels. So if you're getting 175 bushels of corn, you're going to take the phosphorus removed as 0.37 pounds per bushel. And then this also counts for any grain or straw and alfalfa that was removed. So we're going to refer back to that chart in a minute. I'm going to go through an example. As I think every speaker in the room has said today, or almost everyone, we're talking about accurate manure samples. And I don't want to keep repeating what everybody's said all day today, but taking a good sample. If you're taking a solid sample, put it in a bag. If you're taking a liquid sample, use a bottle. Make sure you're labeling those. I have guys that have multiple samples they're taking in. They might be taking 2 or 3 holding barn samples in at the same time from different farms. Make sure you label which one those are coming from. Take a representative sample. I think Kevin alluded to something with manure samples being pulled off the top versus a representative sample of that material. And one of the biggest benefits that we've seen in the Grand Lake watershed when we're required to pull annual manure samples What we can do is we can take, now the rules have been in place for a couple of years, we can take 5 or 6 of those samples and average them for a farm, or we can pull out a bad sample and say, hey, you have 3 really good samples, but this sample over here, for whatever reason, that's not a good sample. So we can average the 3 good samples and get something representative for their manure. It's very important that you pull your own samples and not rely on your neighbors, especially when we're looking at dairy manure, because it's going to vary depending on how many gallons are being used through the milk parlor, how much concrete lot runoff you have, how diluted that material is. So when you're looking at dairy manure especially, those samples are going to vary a lot. Timing and pulling of a sample. In an ideal world, it would be great if we could pull a sample. We have the equipment there, we agitate it up, we pull the sample, we take it to the lab, we get the results, and then we do the manure application. But I think we all know that that's really not going to happen. That's why it's important to have those averages. You can go back to what you had last year, still pull a sample, but keep that in mind for future. Because if you go there and you pull a sample and you haven't agitated pit up, it's not going to be representative. And we see it all the time in the samples that we get in the office. We can tell just by looking at the sample if the sample's been agitated, if it's been pulled in a bad spot, if it's not a good sample, if it's too dry, too wet, diluted down. You can just pick them right off the top. And the last time I checked, the manure samples are costing around $34. That's probably going to depend on the area that you're in, but in my opinion, it's pretty good money spent. So when we look at I know you guys can't probably read this, but the average manure samples, because we're required to take manure samples over our way, these are all the ones that we've averaged for about the last 6-8 months. So all the samples that we receive through the door, which are a couple hundred depending on the type of animals that we're dealing with. But if we would have done this a couple years ago when I first started, our average for hog manure at the time was 30 to 35 pounds per 1,000 gallons of hog manure for phosphorus. And our samples right now are coming in at 23 pounds of phosphorus per 1,000 gallons. So when you're looking at a manure application rate, you go from 23 to 35. That's a big difference on how much phosphorus you're putting out there per 1,000 gallons. And then we're also looking at the moisture content in that manure as well. That really plays in with the steer manure on how wet that material is coming out. That can affect the nutrients. And once you consider the burn-off of all that moisture, it can really play into the amount that you're supposed to be applying. So poultry manure, in this example, in the past we've had some variance in different types of poultry, whether it's pullet manure, turkey manure, hen manure, layers. It really depends on the type of poultry manure. But if you look at these samples, this last batch that we run over last year, there's really not a whole lot of difference. There's a little bit of difference in some of that phosphorus, but just keep in mind, if you're receiving poultry manure, you want to make sure that that sample that you're being provided or providing to somebody else is truly representative of that poultry manure, because it's not all created equally. So the biggest question is knowing how much manure to apply, removal of phosphorus, matching your manure application rates up, and trying to make a reasonable application rate. We're not going to talk a whole lot about nitrogen. That's a whole other topic in itself. But the biggest thing is realizing that if you're not sure how to calculate some of this, please do ask somebody. We have a lot of people across the state that can really help and answer some of these questions. So when we get to some math here, this is the example that I wanted to go through. I wanted to focus on, we deal a lot with a higher soil test level. So we have guys come in, and it's really hard for us to relay to them how much phosphorus they have in the soil. So I'm going to give you an example here, and it's going to give you a little bit different perspective, because we've always heard, you know, it's going to take you 5 years to pull that down, you can only remove X amount of pounds per year per crop if you don't apply anything. So this example here is going to use an average yield goal for for a corn
for a
soybean
corn soybean
rotation.
rotation.
So we have
So we have
175 bushel yield goal for corn.
corn.
We take that,
We take that,
and you take that
and you take that
175 and you
175
multiply
and you
that by that
multiply that by that
0.37 pounds of phosphorus removed per bushel.
Per bushel.
That's going to
That's
equate
going to equate to
to 60, right at 65 pounds of phosphate. And if you do that same equation, and you take the potash removal, you're going to remove about 47 pounds of potash for that year's crop. And then if you have the second year, you have beans in your rotation, you're going to take 50 bushels as an average, and you multiply that by the 0.8 removed per bushel, and that equals 40 pounds of phosphate and 70 pounds of potash. So let's add those up, because that's a 2-year rotation, so we're going to take the 65 plus the 40 equals the 104.75, divide that by 2. So in a 2-year rotation of corn soybeans, on an average year, you're going to remove 52 pounds of phosphate, 59 pounds of potash. So let's take a look at a manure application to meet that. So we're looking at the manure sample to get the pounds of phosphate per 1,000 gallons of manure. So typical 2,400 head hog building, they vary in their production based on their watering system and the management in the barns, but let's just say it produces 700,000 gallons a year. That 700,000 gallons times your 23 pounds of phosphate per 1,000 gallons that you get off the manure sample equals 16,100 pounds of phosphate produced per year out of that hog barn. And then we're going to take that and we're going to divide that up with this corn bean rotation. Your average removal is 52 pounds per year. So you're going to need, on average, 310 acres to utilize that phosphorus and just balance it. It's not going to be in a drawdown or build up. It's just going to balance it. We're going to do the same thing for that potash. You take that 700,000 gallons and you go through the calculations and you're at 308 acres. So that's pretty close. So we're looking at 310 acres you can utilize the Tri-State's required potash and phosphorus needs. So at the end of the day, it shoots out this number and it says, okay, you need 2,258 gallons per acre application rate on 310 acres. How many guys are going to apply that? Every year. Who's going to cover 310 acres? 2,200 gallons. I don't think I would, and I'd have a real hard time telling somebody else to. So it's not really a feasible application rate. But once you start bumping that up, then you're going to really need to consider some of your other aspects. You're going to need to look at the time of year that you're applying, the nitrogen that you're applying. So then we bump it up, and let's just say we're going to double that to 4,500 gallons and cut your acres in half. Is that feasible? Maybe with a tanker. So those are the things that you really need to take a look at when you're looking at the nutrients. Are you trying to do a 3-year rotation? Because we've really tried not to put more nutrients out there than for a 3-year rotation. So knowing what is in that manure sample really plays a lot into how many gallons per acre you can be applying. So when we look at the rule of thumb for nutrient drawdown, this has kind of been all over the board, at least the experience that we have. We have guys bringing samples in saying, hey, I've planted alfalfa for 6 years now and I've drawn my soil test down this many pounds. And we're like, there's no way. And so our general rule of thumb that we've been using is 10 pounds of phosphate removed in a harvested crop drops the soil test phosphorus by 1 pound per acre. General rule of thumb. So if we had that 2-year crop rotation, we're moving 52 pounds, hopefully we can drop that soil test by a couple pounds there. So in a typical soil test, phosphorus may move 3 to 7 pounds depending on the crop and how much yield you get out of that per year. So that leads into the next question. This is what I call the Terry Mesher calculation, because he did this at a training and it has really put a different perspective on how I kind of look at explaining nutrient drawdown to farmers. If we have a soil test level that's 150 pounds per acre, how many years will it take to draw it down to 80 pounds using a corn-soybean rotation? So there's 70 pounds difference. We take the 150 minus the 80, which is the high level of the recommended range. You take that 70 pounds times 10 pounds of phosphate, which is your removal, equals 700 pounds of phosphate. That 700 pounds divided by the bushel calculation, that means that you have enough phosphorus out there without adding anything. That's including starter fertilizer for 1,892 bushels. So what does that equate to? Utilizing your average bushel per acre year. You have enough manure out there for just under 11 years, fertilizer out there for 11 years. So what that means is, if you have a soil test level of 150 and you want to draw it down to 80, you put no commercial fertilizer, no manure, you're going to have enough nutrients out there at a minimum to reach the high end of the maintenance level for 11 years. So then the next question is, if we go to a corn, I'm sorry, that last example was a solid corn sample. This one is a corn bean rotation. So the beans are going to utilize a little bit less phosphorus. So at the end of the day, we're looking at 13 and a half years. So you add on right at 2 years just by putting another crop in there that utilizes less phosphorus. So when we're looking at the higher soil test levels in my area, this is some of the considerations that we have to have. But when we have livestock manure to places to go, that's going to be extended out several years if you're still applying some manure. So let's say you still have to apply manure every couple of years to that. That's just going to add on how many years of manure that you have available. So the other part of that is, today I've asked a couple of people what do they consider a high soil test level. I've gotten three different answers. I've gotten 60 pounds of phosphorus, gotten 120 pounds, and I've gotten 200 pounds. So what is a high soil test level? In our area, I'm happy if a guy brings a soil test level in below 150 pounds per acre. So maybe up here is a 60 soil test level high. I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's good to have this information to know how many nutrients you're putting out there. So in summary, you don't have to be a crop consultant to figure some of this out. The calculations are really simple. They're in the tri-state. With a small amount of information, you're going to have a few bucks out of your pocket to run manure samples, spend some time doing some calculations, spend some time making sure that you're pulling your soil test levels or soil samples that they're good samples, and spend some time and work with the people that are pulling them if you're not. Understand how much manure you're applying. Take credit for all your nutrient applications. Like I said, those examples weren't even utilizing starter fertilizer. And again, knowing what you're actually applying out there. And like I said, we won't talk much about the nitrogen because there's a lot of different variables that play into that. And when we're looking at applications, we really do focus on a lot of the phosphorus and potassium. So with that, I'll take any questions, or I'll take questions and send them on to Terry since he wasn't here. Yes.
In the Grand Lakes St. Mary's watershed, at what level are you forbidding them to apply manure? Repeat the question.
The question is, in the Grand Lakes St. Mary's watershed, what level are we not permitting any future more manure applications? 300 pounds per acre. Yes. If it's commercial fertilizer, you're not supposed to be applying above the 60 or 80 that you're tri-state follows. Most of our applications, if the farmers follow our nutrient management plans that we've laid out in the Grand Lake watershed, our soil test levels should never increase from where they're at. They should maintain or draw down. And we'll be able to tell, regardless of what records they give us, looking at the soil test moving forward, we'll be able to tell if they are following your plans or not. Any more questions?
Anything else? Super. Let's thank Francis for coming.
For not being your expertise, you did a good job.
He's better than Terry anyhow. That's all I think. Okay, we're going to switch over here to Dr. Baker. Dead batteries.
Say that's appropriate, but I don't want to get in trouble.
I'll go to my alternate title, since this is a conservation tillage program, and that is don't strap your moldboard plow.
Okay.
I'll tell you why.
Okay, I got batteries replaced. Dr. Baker works for Heidelberg College. Although many of you don't have a lot of knowledge about this, he has the longest, by far the longest history of water testing in the Western Lake Erie Basin. I mean, it's a set of records that we can look back on for a long time, help speed up our current research somewhat. It's ongoing. Laura Johnson does a lot of what Dr. Baker used to do. So let me get this microphone hooked up to him and I'll turn it over.
Okay, here we go. Don't scrap your moldboard plow. I'll be talking about the connections between what's going on in Lake Erie and what's happening on cropland in northwestern Ohio. As we see it from studying rivers that are kind of the connection between the farmland and Lake Erie. Lake Erie has undergone what's called reeutrophication. And so if we look at a long-term record of Lake Erie going back to the 1970s through 2020, and look at various eutrophication indicators such as harmful algal blooms, oxygen depletion in the central basin, shoreline falling by algae, or just algal densities. All of these would show that in the 1970s things were really bad. They improved a great deal. Now have gotten worse again to the point where they're worse than they were in the 1970s in many instances. This is a generalized curve. If we look at a specific example, this might be algal densities. We can see that they dropped into the mid-1990s, then have gotten worse again, both in the Western Basin and the Central Basin. So this whole issue of reeutrophication is thought to be caused by the amount of phosphorus that's going into Lake Erie down the rivers, the major tributaries such as the Maumee. So if we look at Lake Erie as a whole and look at the total amount of phosphorus going into the lake back to the 1967, this 25,000 metric tons dropped very rapidly to the early 1980s, and then has dropped rather slowly since that time. That's total phosphorus loaded into Lake Erie. This drop here was really caused primarily by treatment being implemented at municipal sewage treatment plants. That was the major source that really caused the big drops in loading. But total phosphorus hasn't increased since the early 1980s. It's decreased slightly. So why are we calling for 40% reductions in phosphorus loading to Lake Erie if total phosphorus hasn't gone up? Well, the reason is that what has changed is not the amount of phosphorus, but the composition of total phosphorus going into the lake. Well, what do I mean by composition? This is the Sandusky River in Tiffin during a runoff event, rather brown, muddy water coming down. We can pull a sample, and we have 20,000 samples from the Sandusky River near Fremont at this point in time. We can analyze it for total phosphorus that includes both the phosphorus that's dissolved in the water and the phosphorus that's attached to the sediment. And then we can filter out what's attached to the sediment and simply look at the clear water that comes through. That's what contains the dissolved reactive phosphorus, or DRP. The particular phosphorus, we actually don't measure it directly, but we do measure total phosphorus, and we measure dissolved phosphorus, so it's easy enough to calculate by difference the particulate phosphorus that's going down the lake. And what's important to know is that just like on your cropland in the soil, not all of the phosphorus present in the soil is available to support crop growth. Maybe even only half of it is, if that. The same for phosphorus going down into the lake. The particulate phosphorus is only about, is only about 25% bioavailable. The dissolved reactive phosphorus is 100% bioavailable to algae. So let's look at the trends in these two kinds of phosphorus in the Maumee River. This goes back to 1975 for loading, and this is the particular phosphorus loads. They're larger than the dissolved phosphorus, but they have been dropping slowly. They're very noisy from year to year because of the weather conditions, for that matter. That's what, right. In any one year, the loading is driven by the amount of, or the weather conditions that year. But if we look at the total or dissolved phosphorus loads, they drop, and then they've gotten much larger again. And although it's still variable from year to year, likewise, the algal blooms in the lake vary from year to year. But what we're pretty concerned about then is this increase in dissolved phosphorus loading going down the Maumee River and the other tributaries going into the lake. So why have the particular phosphorus loads decreased while DRP loads have increased? Or that's what has happened. The net effect of these two is that the amount of phosphorus that's bioavailable to stimulate algal growth has increased. So that's the net effect on bioavailable phosphorus loading. So why have these things changed? If we look, well, the phosphorus load in any one year depends on the product of phosphorus concentrations in the water times the river flow. If river flow stays the same, then the loading will depend on the concentrations. Concentrations go up, loads go up. Concentrations drop, loads drop. If, on the other hand, if the concentration is the same, but the river flow goes up, the loads go up. It's just a product of the two all the time. And so, which has been more important in causing the changes in loads? Is it because we have more water going down the river, or because concentrations have changed? These are the concentrations of particular phosphorus up here in the Maumee River. They've generally gone down. Here's the concentrations of dissolved phosphorus. They dropped rapidly up to the mid-1995, and since then they've tended to go up by quite a bit. And this is the loads the flow or discharge of the river, and it too has gone up somewhat. It's certainly variable from year to year, and more variable than the concentrations. But the increase in concentration of dissolved phosphorus is much larger, in fact, than the increase in discharge of the river. So we think so the question becomes, what's happened on the cropland? Well, how do we know it's cropland? Let's back up a notch and look at cropland issues. How do we know agriculture is causing these changes? Well, this is where we've all heard of the watershed approach. And that's what's used in order to quantify non-point pollution or land runoff from point sources. This watershed approach then, boundary, any rain that falls inside that boundary runs downhill to these streams. These pipes here are an example of what would be coming in at the municipalities in the watershed. And so the way you measure the non-point source pollution is to get information on how many tons per year of phosphorus are coming in from all these treatment plants. And that's reported to the U.S. or Ohio EPA, and then you also measure the total watershed output. And given those two measurements, the total output from the watershed, and that's where our lab comes in. We're monitoring total watershed output at 18 stations in Ohio now, with 3 samples a day going year-round. And when there's a flood runoff, we analyze all 3 of them, otherwise a sample a day. So this is an extremely detailed data set for runoff. In any case, what we do then is simply take the total watershed output, we subtract the point source inputs, and that gives us the non-point source TP output. And so when we do that for the Maumee River, for the last 10 years, this is what we get. The blue bars here are the point source inputs, on average about 5%, only 5% of the phosphorus that goes out the Maumee River. That's at most what's coming from the point sources like Fort Wayne and Defiance and Lima and so forth. So anyway, non-point source variable, 95% of the problem. About 73% of the land use in the Maumee is agricultural land. And so that's just looking at the land use, you have to conclude that most of this phosphorus is coming from cropland. Okay, so how have changes in cropland management changed these loads or concentrations? Well, this is a success story, believe it or not. It does reflect the success of the erosion control programs that farmers have implemented on the cropland in northwestern Ohio. We have seen decreases in the concentrations of sediment in these rivers. Sediment has decreased even more than the particulate phosphorus because the sediment control programs, erosion control programs, reduce the larger particle size more effectively than they do the finer particle sizes. And fines are what have a higher ratio of particulate phosphorus. So if we were to plot sediment up here, you see even bigger reductions than you see for particulate phosphorus. So these the erosion control programs have worked. Now, what about the causes of the increased DRP? Well, I'm saying that the increases in DRP concentrations are caused in part by these same erosion control measures. So the erosion control measures to stop particulate phosphorus end up increasing DRP concentrations for reasons that are well known and were known in the 1970s when we launched the erosion control programs. But the particulate phosphorus back then was better than 80% of the total phosphorus going down the river was particulate. And that left less than 20% being DRP. So it made sense in order to achieve total phosphorus reductions at that time to focus on erosion control. But now, the dissolved phosphorus is almost more than 30% of the total phosphorus load, and it's bioavailable. So let's see just how this happens. How is it that no-till can increase the DRP concentration? And what we see, what we simply look at is how phosphorus moves from cropland to streams and rivers. This is a diagram from the 1970s. Rainfall starts to run off the field when it exceeds the infiltration capacity of the soil. And this will erode the surface materials that carries the particulate phosphorus. But also this rainfall that's running off the surface interacts with the upper layer of soil in the field. This is called the zone of interaction. And so it's this interaction that will move some of the phosphorus that's present in this zone of interaction as soluble phosphorus into the runoff water, and so the surface runoff carries both particulate and dissolve into the rivers. A small amount of phosphorus was thought to be leaching and coming under subsurface runoff. But what we also know now is that the DRP concentration in this runoff water, the concentration of dissolved phosphorus, depends on the soil test levels in the upper inch of soil, or the upper 2 inches of soil. And so the higher the soil test levels, the higher the concentration in the runoff water. We also now know that a whole lot of the phosphorus that's coming into our streams is actually going through macropores down to the tile drainage line, and some of the recent research has shown that the bulk of the dissolved phosphorus and even a large share of the particulate phosphorus is moving through these macropores down to the tile lines and coming out the tile. And it used to be it was not only the nitrate came out the tile. Now we recognize that it's not just the nitrate. There's a lot of dissolved phosphorus coming out thanks to macropores, it turns out. And as you may know, no-till, mulch-till, these things can increase both superficial phosphorus, soil test levels, and macropore development in the soil. So there are two ways that no-till, mulch-till, these erosion control measures can in fact increase DRP runoff. So in the Sandusky watershed, we launched a stratified soil testing program. Incidentally, phosphorus is fairly immobile in the soil, and so when you apply phosphorus at the surface of the soil, or when crop residue breaks down at the surface, that phosphorus hangs around the surface and it builds up the soil test levels. It's called phosphorus stratification. It happens in forests, it happens in pastures, it happens all over, as it turns out. So we wanted to see how much stratification was present. We collaborated with CCAs. We tested over 1,800 fields. We had the CCAs collect an agronomic soil test, 0 to 8 inches, but at the same time they collected cores that they divided into 0 to 2 and 2 to 8, also 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 8. So we have a very large data set. These are the averages that we got. The average soil test level, this is Mehlich, it's not pounds per acre, this is the Mehlich test in part per million. In the Sandusky is 45. The average Mehlich at the top inch was 69 part per million. The average Mehlich down at the bottom, the bottom 3 inches, was 35 parts per million. Now those are low phosphorus test levels, relatively low Mehlich. Yet the Sandusky River, where we collected these, has almost the highest export rate of phosphorus and soil and dissolved phosphorus and total phosphorus of any of the rivers we studied, except when we get to the Scioto and the Great Miami, where we have big cities that are still dumping in excessive amounts of phosphorus. The phosphorus removal requirements hit the Lake Erie Basin cities, but not the Ohio River cities, at least initially. So anyway, what do we do? Well, this is another picture of the same data. This shows the agronomic soil tests on the x-axis, soil tests at the upper inch on this axis. If they were the same or 1 to 1, they'd be along this red line right here, the heavy red line. And you can see that the amount of stratification at a given agronomic soil test level is highly variable. And so what else to do about variability in soil testing, for that matter? In any event, it is highly variable, and so unless you measure it, you won't know what your superficial, what fraction of your total phosphorus content in your 0 to 8 is actually way up at the top inch. It can dry out and not serve as a particularly good source of phosphorus for your crops in a dry year. So we're advocates of this kind of stratified soil testing to figure out so you know where your nutrients are. And on average, the superficial soil test levels are 55% higher than the agronomic soil test that the farmer that you would be looking at when you get the soil test. Do increases in Mehlich 3 soil test levels of this in this range and of this amount really matter when it comes to dissolved phosphorus runoff? Well, this has been a controversial point in Ohio, but there's a lot of data that shows that yes, even at these low Mehlich test levels, under 80 and so forth, there is an increase in dissolved phosphorus with those kind of increases in Mehlich. And this is comparing 3 different soil tests. This is a widely used thing. But, so in any event, what we do see is that Mehlich increases in this range do increase dissolved reactive phosphorus. And here's an example of where you started no-tilling, conventional tillage. This is what happens to the DRP runoff at an edge of field level. And there's quite a bit of data of this type. That's an example. So another cause of increased DRP concentrations, remember I said that soil test levels were in part of the cause, is what we've been talking about here often today is fertilizer application just before precipitation. There's lots of edge of field data on that, but we can also see it in the rivers. This is the Honey Creek discharge fall of 2011. It's a tributary to the Sandusky River, about 130 square mile watershed. So it's a pretty good sized watershed. And that fall, we had this is dissolved reactive phosphorus. And when we get up to a 400 or 0.4 milligrams per liter dissolved phosphorus, that's unusually high. Well, the next thing we knew, we were getting samples around 0.6 milligrams per liter. Then a storm where we had dissolved phosphorus at 1 milligram per liter in a river draining 140 square mile watershed. This was during our soil stratification meetings or study, and what we found out was that the custom applicators were in the fields. It was a wet fall, but they got to get the fertilizer out. So they did go out, and then you had rainstorms. Here was an example of a rainstorm right after custom application, another one. And so we had, fortunately this is unusual, but it does happen, and you can pick it up in the river monitoring programs. This is from a smaller watershed we have up in Defiance County, unnamed tributary to Lost Creek, so it's pretty small. But in any event, we had this picture of application on snow, and then shortly after we saw that picture, we had some snowmelt events that, again, we had our GRP skyrocketing up to exceptionally high values. So we can see it's not just at the edge of field level that these things happen, but when you're in an agricultural watershed, you see it at the watershed scale as well. Well, so the problem is you people are amazingly efficient in the use of the fertilizer that you're applying. What do I mean by when I say that? Well, we can calculate the pounds per acre per year of total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus that are coming out of these watersheds. And so, for example, the Maumee is 0.29 pounds per acre per year of dissolved phosphorus. And then we can do some adjustments, recognizing that some of the land use, like forests in the watershed, maybe 10%, don't export at that higher rate. So we can adjust this up to maybe from 0.29 to a third of a pound per acre per year. And then dissolved phosphorus, then here we're comparing this with the maintenance application, and NRCS said in the Sandusky watershed, over the rotations we have, maintenance application would be about 47.5 pounds P2O5 per acre per year. That translates into 20.8 pounds of phosphorus per acre, 1.6%. So, in other words, what's causing the problems in Lake Erie in terms of dissolved phosphorus represents only 1.6% of a maintenance application to sustain the yields that we have in this area. Is that a problem? Yes. How in the world are we going to reduce it any further? Well, there are things you can do. But I think it's important that everyone recognize what the situation is, and that farmers are in fact not losing excessive amounts. Now, a couple of things though. How about the bad actor? You know, how much of the problem can be blamed on just these isolated people where we have really, really, really bad situations? And the general thought, I think, is that we can't blame very much of it on them. In fact, it's all of us doing a little bit that is the problem. And so what can we do? And so that's where, how do we reduce this loss rate by less than 2%, by 40%? Well, that's a lot of the efforts in the conference today are working on this issue. But what we would say is that you need to do or include stratified soil sampling in your monitoring your fields that can help you agronomically. Where fields are highly stratified, i.e., it turns out, I'm going to skip, 4R methods to minimize subsequent stratification, avoid application on frozen and snow-covered grounds, that's already in the works. Use water management practices that minimize total runoff. If we can keep more water in our soil, then that's going to reduce the total flow volume going down into the lake. Build soil health to improve soil tilth, and include rainfall infiltration. The soil, the subsoil that we have, long before you get to where the tiles are, is a treatment system. If we can get the water to move through it, rather than down the macropores. But what might we accomplish if we had stratified soil testing data? And for example, if we would take the fields where we have superficial soil tests at 20 part per million higher than the agronomic, so we'd be able to pick out the fields with at least that much stratification, 20 part per million, and do a one-time soil inversion, say before corn in a 3-year rotation. So in 3 years, well, let's say it covers about 50% of the fields have stratification greater than 20 parts per million. So 50% of the fields we would treat, and you would treat that over a 3-year period, plowing perhaps before corn each time. That's not going to change your erosion rate very much. I should have also mentioned that where stratification is studied in a pure no-till system, stratification is much higher than what I've shown you. This is a small amount of stratification, but we have rotational no-till, not pure no-till. And then the problem is that even when you use cover crops, that can increase stratification. Anyway, the calculations are that this treating half the fields with a one-time soil inversion would reduce the dissolved phosphorus loading by 28% over by the end of that 3-year period, assuming that you're taking steps to minimize stratification subsequently to the plowing. That means the no-till and the cover crops and things like that. But from the preceding talk, you know that to achieve a 28% reduction by drawdown will take a heck of a long time. And so this could be, to the extent that any kind of quick fix is available, this at least ought to be investigated at this point in time to see if it would really work, given the soil types that we have in northwestern Ohio. So I'm going to stop at that point and take any questions. Yeah.
Has there been any studies done where organic matter percent was tested on what was coming off of fields with higher organic matter?
Well, I think that, yes, the organic soils do have higher export rates of phosphorus. So where we have muckland, of course you have vegetable crops, you're pouring on the fertilizer there, and you do get higher rates. How much of it is strictly the organic matter, how much of it is the kind of cropping you do there, I don't know.
Higher organic and better tills, so
Yeah. Well, we know we have complete soil test records on all those 1,800 fields, and there's not a lot of organic matter, and the historical records show declines. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is, in your statement, you said that forest lands produce dissolved reactive phosphorus also.
But very low rates.
Okay.
Okay.
Why then, in this 1990 to 2012, have we seen dissolved reactive phosphorus coming out and causing algae problems where there is no commercial agriculture? So
you're talking about lakes, small lakes in Ohio.
yes.
Yeah. Good question. The question was, we're seeing algal blooms in smaller lakes, inland lakes in Ohio that don't have agriculture. How do we know that it's not some other factor that's causing the dissolved reactive phosphorus or the algal blooms? And
Well, not that's causing the algal blooms, but what's causing the dissolved particulate phosphorus to turn into dissolved reactive phosphorus at a higher rate than it ever did before. That would be the question, would be why, if it's ag in what we're doing, then why is it happening where there's no ag?
Well, what we do know in the ag situation is that there's a very good correlation time-wise between the adoption of conservation tillage and these erosion control measures and the onset of eutrophication. And we don't have historical stratified data, but we see where we are now, and we also know from edge of field data that stratification does build up. That's increasing the soil test levels, and that would be happening in the ag and the cropland, but not necessarily in the forest. The other thing is we study forest and watersheds, and they have a much lower export of phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus, like the Muskingum or the Grand watershed. So we can use comparative analyses. But you're raising good questions.
Okay, with that, we're going to have to cut off. Let's give Dr. Baker a thank you. Okay, we've Dr. Camarado comes from Purdue University. He's done a lot of work for a lot of years on nitrogen. We've had him back at CTC from time to time. We're going to spend some time on nitrogen and how to allocate for livestock manure. So with that, I'm going to hook this up to you. Just stick that in a pocket or something. And hook this to here. See if that works for you.
Okay. Hear me in the back, okay?
Right forward to left, reverse on that.
And I can move around.
Pointer to the top, and I can turn you up here if I need to.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have been doing this a long time. I started in 1989 working with manure, much to the dismay of my parents, who had spent a lot of money sending me to school and thought working with manure maybe didn't justify their investment. I'll tell you, when I didn't start in Indiana with Purdue, I started somewhere else that has a good football team. And the first introduction I got to the industry, the fertilizer industry, by my department head, one of the fertilizer dealers said, "I am sick and tired of blank, 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 bringing in people here to ruin our business." And my department head asked me to leave the room, you know, and they had a discussion. So at the time, every time I talked to a farmer, they would say, "I hear these manures, the nutrients aren't available in those manures, are they? And I need to add just as much nitrogen and phosphorus as I would whether as fertilizer as if I didn't use manure, and all the micronutrients aren't available either." And that was the common perception throughout the farmers that I was working with. And so we've come a long way since then, now acknowledging the fact that those nutrients are actually available in manure, that we can actually utilize those nutrients as a benefit to crop production, and that there are issues related to those nutrients because they do build up to high levels when we're utilizing manure. The other thing I noticed when I looked at the research that had been done, mostly in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of it was targeted to how much can we put on a single piece of land and not reduce yield or kill the crop. So there was the disposal attitude in the 70s, and just looking for a limited amount of land so we didn't have to haul manure, etc. Again, things have changed quite a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit in general about manure management in the beginning, and then specifically about nitrogen. I don't mean to isolate nitrogen separate from phosphorus and potassium and all the other issues. You had plenty of talks today, and really you have to take a coordinated, holistic approach to managing manure. My presentation will be on my website by the end of the week, and it's soilfertility.info. If you want to pull this up and look at it at a later date, since we don't have handouts. Manure is an economical source of nutrients, especially when soils test low in P and K. And we heard today with our talks that oftentimes we get an accumulation of P and K because we're going to try to primarily use the manure as a nitrogen source. Once those soil test levels get built up to a certain high level where you take many years to deplete those nutrients, we're trying to use that manure as a nitrogen source. So we want to use it as efficiently as possible, because really the only short-term value we're going to get from the manure is from the nitrogen component. And no matter what we say, utilizing this manure and recycling those nutrients to crops is the best use. We don't have any alternatives that can be widespreadly adopted widespread. Well, why is it difficult to use manure? Even our highest nutrient concentration, the poultry litter, poultry manure, is a fairly dilute source of nutrients. You're talking about on a as-is basis, typically less than 5% NP and K, and in the liquid manures, substantially lower than that. We heard earlier about sampling. Manure composition can vary quite a bit by the age of the animal, the diet, the handling system, the season, control of water. I think one of the biggest improvements that I've seen in almost 30 years now is the utilization of water and the efficiency of water use in the rearing facilities, and having manure that's drier, therefore a higher concentration. And also from a nitrogen standpoint, the drier the manure can be kept, the less water that's introduced, the more aerobic that manure is, the more nitrogen is actually retained in the manure and can be transferred to the fields. manures that are complete nutrient sources. The micronutrients are available, the phosphorus, potassium, and of course nitrogen is available too, but when they're used for, based on their nitrogen content, you over apply most every other plant nutrient. Retaining more of that nitrogen in the manure through handling helps with that because it concentrates the nitrogen, reduces the losses from the facility, and makes it a better balanced fertilizer. And then I think one of the things that's really overlooked a lot is how difficult it is to be uniform with the manure. We're going to have to make decisions on whether we need more nitrogen or whether we have enough. And it's not that important for phosphorus and potassium when you have way more than you need in every part of the field. But when you're trying to manage nitrogen closely to provide what is necessary, then non-uniformity becomes an issue because you have areas of the field that don't have enough and other areas that have too much. So, just a few steps here, kind of review. We need a good sample, we need to know the nutrient content, and we have to have a reasonable assessment of how available those nutrients are. And again, that's most difficult with nitrogen. We need good soil sample and a requirement of the crop to be grown. The speaker earlier talked about crop removal of phosphorus, particularly when soil test phosphorus is high. Those levels of nutrients in the grain are fairly consistent and have stayed fairly similar over the last 30 years. That's one of our best estimates in doing our nutrient manure and nutrient calculations is what's actually removed from the field. Of course, we want to be uniformly. We talked about that at the correct rate. One of the students asked me about calibrating manure spreaders. Did we ever do that? Sure. We put out tarps and pans and caught manure in the field in our research, and most of the growers that I worked with, of course with liquid it's not as hard, but with solid manures, poultry manures, you need to know how much you have in your spreader and kind of adjust it to put out the right amount for based on the nutrient analysis and the desired application rate. We need to reduce or supplement with other nutrients as well, and primarily we're going to be supplementing with nitrogen and eliminating the commercial applications of P and K and micronutrients. And then there's a big advantage to incorporating nutrients, and I know this is a conservation tillage conference, but injecting into the soil and some incorporation has always been one way to reduce nutrient loss and the odor and fly issue that come along with some manures. And then above and beyond that, there's other conservation practices that help filter that water as it leaves the field and help to reduce some of the nutrient impacts of those nutrients. So let's talk specifically about nitrogen. In Indiana, the thing I see that really most affects nitrogen availability, that's probably similar here, is application timing. So we have facilities that don't have much storage, and you see manure being applied to fields that will grow corn in May, with applications occurring in August, in September, in October, in November, in December, in January, and February. So the timing is not ideal to optimize nitrogen use, and you'll see that a lot of our manures are really not much different than commercial fertilizers in the forms and availability of nitrogen in those manures. If we're going to put manure on the soil surface, There's a component of most manures that's in the ammonia, ammonium, or urea-like form, and it's subject to ammonia volatilization. So anytime we leave a manure on the soil surface, we have the opportunity to lose some of that nitrogen to the air. There's a component that's organic. That's going to be available over time. And the availability is dependent on temperature, moisture, soil type, incorporation, and all of those factors. And so that's something that we have to estimate, and it varies from year to year. And I just state the obvious, availability is difficult to predict. So we're doing a lot of estimating and guessing and assuming in determining nitrogen availability. So composition affects that availability, timing, placement, and rate, soil properties, weather, temperature, and rainfall, the interaction of all of the above. And recently there's a lot of interest in putting manure and cover crops out together and allowing the cover crops to take up some of that nitrogen and then trying to predict how much of it and when is it going to become available. And all that really is still in the research phase, because that even more complicates the estimates of nitrogen availability. All right, so manure analysis. I think most laboratories nowadays estimate both ammonia or ammonium nitrogen and organic nitrogen. Most manures, unless you do composting, poultry litters, most of the time nitrate is inconsequential or absent from the manure. So we're basically dealing with what's reported as ammonia or ammonium nitrogen and organic nitrogen. There's also some urea and urea-like compounds that are in manures, and they're generally represented in the organic nitrogen fraction. And they would be more available, their availability would be more like ammonia or ammonium. So here we have a poultry litter, and the total nutrient content here in these two columns is reported on a wet weight or an as applied basis. And you see here we have the total nitrogen, which is broken out into ammonia, nitrogen, and organic nitrogen. They actually measured nitrate nitrogen, and you see it's a very small value, so they didn't even calculate how many pounds per ton nitrate were in this particular poultry manure. It reminded me of when in 1989 we started a manure analysis program at the university I was at the time, and I produced a report something like this, and this old crusty professor said to me, "Have you ever taken a manure sample?" And I said, "I've taken a few." He said, "Have you ever spread manure?" I said, I've spread some. He said, "Do you really need to report the nitrogen content of the manure to 2 decimal places, given the variability in manure sampling and manure and the spreading ability of the people that you're going to be working with?" And I said, "I guess not." So don't get too into the numbers here. You know, we don't need to carry it to 2 or 3 decimal places. Basically, there's about 40-something pounds of organic nitrogen per ton in this manure, and about 13 pounds of ammonia or ammonium nitrogen. The solid manures are going to be more organic nitrogen and less ammonium nitrogen, and this 1-to-3 or even a 1-to-4 ratio would be pretty common in poultry manures, depending on how the manure is handled. So it's important to recognize that total N and available N are not the same thing. There's a fraction of that organic N that even when we would incubate it in the laboratory under ideal conditions, you can never find. So it's in some compound that's not going to release, over the course of a year or year and a half. Maybe it comes out eventually, but when we looked at it in these laboratory experiments, we never found it. So how much of that organic N does come out and when does it come out are important in determining the availability. And then these really inorganic compounds, ammonia, ammonium, and urea. Ammonium can be taken up by the plant. All three of those compounds are going to change to nitrate nitrogen. And really, we're just worried about how much of that stuff we lose. If we can capture it all in the soil and keep it from going out in the tile or up in the atmosphere, it's basically 100% available. It's just how much of it gets lost between when we put it out and when the crop can utilize it. We use a pretty intricate estimate of nitrogen availability. I'm not quite sure what's officially used in Ohio, but I think this approach is reasonable, and something similar to it would be advisable. So it considers the type of manure, liquid, solid, and whether it's irrigated. It's based on ammonium and organic nitrogen measurements, so not some labs may just now report total N, but in order to use this availability, you need to know both forms. And then how it's placed in the soil, whether it's injected, incorporated, or left on the soil surface. And then we break Indiana into northern and southern and look at month of the year. So temperature and rainfall is going to have a big influence on availability, particularly the further out from planting the manure is applied. And I'll just show you this chart. We're not going to really look at it in detail, but to show you here, I think the battery is going in this thing too. It's kind of weakening as we talk. So here we have a surface applied, not incorporated liquid manure, and we're looking at the ammonium, nitrogen, and how much of it remains available. So this number represents 30% of that nitrogen becoming available to a crop planted the next spring. So if we're talking about ammonium, we're not talking about it not becoming available to the plant. We're talking about it being lost before the plant can utilize it. And then when we get up into the winter applications, the estimate is maybe 95% available, so not a whole lot of loss. Brad Jorn is responsible for these numbers. They're based on research and research in the literature, and they're reasonable estimates. The organic nitrogen doesn't change much depending on when it's applied, and the organic N from the non-poultry manure, so your dairy, horse, swine, is fairly low. It's only 30 to 35%, and the poultry organic N is as high as 60%. Okay, that's good, thanks. Yeah, having two of these is bad news because I know I'm going to be messing up here. So this is just a plot of the availability over time. Again, we have a lot of particularly liquid manure that goes out after wheat in August and September, and you see the availability of the ammonium nitrogen is pretty low. For incorporated manure, it's about 45%, and for surface applied, it's down around 30%. So most of the nitrogen loss occurs because it's just out so far from planting that the ammonium converts to nitrate, and then that nitrate can be lost in the tile or go up in the atmosphere through denitrification. the surface application loses a little additional nitrogen just for the fact that it's sitting on the soil surface. It has a high pH. It drives off some of the ammonia before a rainfall occurs. That ammonia loss is highly dependent on how soon it rains after application. If you get a rain within the first few days, then a lot of that ammonia nitrogen will be captured in the soil. Most of the loss occurs over the first 5 to 7 days, so anything beyond that doesn't really matter because most of the nitrogen has been lost during that first several days. So if you were going to incorporate manure to capture nitrogen, you need to do it shortly after application as possible, because otherwise that ammonia has already been lost to the atmosphere. When those materials are put out later in the year and with cold temperatures, both the conversion of ammonia to nitrate and its subsequent loss and the ammonia loss to the atmosphere are reduced by the cold temperatures. And so that later application, if you don't have snow melt or rain on frozen ground, can capture more nitrogen than earlier applications. Dr. Baker mentioned the very important environmental losses of phosphorus and suggested they weren't agronomically very important. So we weren't losing a whole lot of phosphorus from the fertilizer application, even though that little loss has a big impact on the environment. With nitrogen, you have a big impact on the environment, and the losses are agronomically significant. I'll show you an example later which looks like we lost 250 pounds of nitrogen applied in a dairy mill. Commonly, you're going to easily lose 30 pounds, 50 pounds or more of the nitrogen that's applied in the manure, depending on when it's applied and the weather, etc. But the losses are substantial, both agronomically and environmentally. Organic N availability doesn't change a whole lot with the season or the application month. So it's typically pretty small, 60% or so for poultry, and half that for non-poultry organic N. So here's our poultry litter sample with about a third of the nitrogen in the ammonium form. And we're going to put it out in August after wheat. And we're only going to capture about 20% of the ammonium nitrogen and about half of it organic nitrogen. So our plant available nitrogen content is only about 26 pounds of plant available nitrogen per ton. That's an estimate. It can be higher than that. It can be considerably lower than that, depending on what happens between August and May. If we put it out in February in preparation for planting, soils are cold, we get some rainfall to move the ammonia in, we're going to capture most of the ammonium and about the same amount of organic N, and we've increased our plant available nitrogen by about 50%. So this timing is very important in capturing as much nitrogen as possible, and the closer that application can be put out to the planting of the crop, the better off you are. A dairy lagoon liquid, the liquid manures are going to be equal or more ammonium than organic N, and so the surface application has the potential to lose a larger percentage of the total nitrogen that's in the manure. Here with surface application, instead of having about 17 pounds of available nitrogen, or total nitrogen, we're going to reduce plant available nitrogen to only a third of the total, and only have about 5 pounds per 1,000 gallons. It should not be tons, it should be 1,000 gallons. And then if we can wait till February, we double that plant available nitrogen. So again, timing is the most important component. So that's just an estimate of availability depending on all those factors we talked about, and a lot dependent on the weather. The availability can vary from season to season. So we worked with a farmer that periodically uses dairy manure in his operation. So I think every other year or every third year, he contracts with a neighbor farmer to put about 14,000 gallons of dairy manure. Depending on the weather, sometime in October and November, most of it he shoots to get on in early November if the weather cooperates and the soils are not too wet. Each time he takes a sample, typically it has about 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and with an estimated availability based on those calculations I showed you earlier of about 130 pounds of available nitrogen per acre. We had done a number of trials with him on his non-manured land, and we found that he needs about 200 pounds of nitrogen, commercial fertilizer nitrogen, side dress to maximize yield. So we're putting out 130. We would expect that he's going to need more in the spring of the year because he's going to lose some of the nitrogen from the manure and some of the organic fraction wouldn't be available. So beginning in 2010, he said he learned enough about his non-manured ground. He wanted to do these field trials with his manured ground and look at nitrogen response. So in the first year, we put out different rates of fertilizer, starter only, about 35 pounds of nitrogen up to about 150 pounds of nitrogen, so 35 starter and about 115 side dress. We looked at this response and compared it to the previous 4 years that we did trials on his non-manured ground, and it was no different. We never reached maximum yield, and we estimated that it may have been like his other trials, and we probably needed 200 pounds or so nitrogen to maximize yield. Basically, he got no nitrogen value out of that manure that he put out in the first week in November. All the nitrogen was presumably lost. It could have been locked up in the manure, but that's not likely. So in 2011, we expanded our in rate. We weren't high enough in 2010. We shifted the curve upwards. And the results were totally different. Basically, it looks like he got tremendous value out of the manure. He almost maximized yield with starter only. Surely by this 100-pound mark or so, somewhere between there and there, he maximized his yield, and it looked like maybe the estimate of availability wasn't too bad. Oh. We did it in 2012. It averaged 48 bushels, probably not representative. We did not show it. 2013, another pretty flat response curve with a lot of value from that manure put out in the fall of the year. 2014, 235 bushels with that fall application. Doesn't really look like he lost a lot of manure nitrogen. So now we figure we're doing it again in 2015. 2010 was an anomaly. He is getting a lot of value, except 2015. Very strong response to fertilizer nitrogen, very similar to the non-manured ground. And it doesn't look like he got much value out of the fall applied in. Now you think you could look at the weather data and make sense of this? These are different fields. He's moving this around the farm. We have manure analysis for every year. There's nothing that I can look at. Rainfall has Cocoa Ross site, he actually measured rainfall and temperature every day, and reports it on the internet. But really, no rhyme or reason to these real strong responses where the manure had no nitrogen value, and these real flat responses where the manure had more value than you would predict. So what can you do? I think manure analysis and calibration and estimates of availability, those are good starting points. But I don't think we're going to figure out how to optimally use manure without making measurements during the season. And the one that we've typically relied on has been the pre-sidedress soil nitrate test to measure what's in the soil early in the season, and then making adjustments beyond that. There's sensors and there's computer models and aerial imagery and satellite imagery. Those things are coming on. And they are going to be most useful in manure fields. But really, there's not a lot of data yet to support their use. So a PSNT would be sampling the upper 1 foot or sometimes 2 foot of soil just prior to side dress time. The longer you wait, the more accurate assessment of availability. Takes a lot of cores. Soil nitrogen is very variable, particularly when manure is used as the nitrogen source. Those cores need to be mixed thoroughly and a subsample taken. Samples for nitrate and ammonium ought to be sent to the laboratory immediately or kept cold, because the nitrogen will increase dramatically as the soil sits in a warm, moist soil bag. So you want to handle those samples appropriately and get them to the lab right away and keep them cold, as cold as possible. Most people measure nitrate. Sometimes we measure ammonium. Ammonium is the predominant source in the manure. You're counting on it being transformed to nitrate, but if it's been cold or wet, that nitrogen is going to stay in the ammonium form. So sometimes I like to measure the ammonium as well as nitrate. This test is really going to be best with manure or maybe a perennial legume. It's not particularly useful if you don't have those nitrogen sources in the cropping system. So if you just have corn and soybeans that have been fertilized, unless you have a 2012 where maybe a lot carries over, it's not too helpful to take samples, and I wouldn't waste my time in those situations. But with manure or a cover crop that's got a lot of legume or an old alfalfa field, PSNT can be useful. The test, there's really 2 components of it. It's very good at telling you when no more nitrogen is needed, and that's a critical level of 25 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. There's a lot of data to support that as a cutoff. If you're above that, you're unlikely to get a response to nitrogen. And that's illustrated here. When research that was done throughout the Eastern Corn Belt showed that about 67% of the time levels were above 25 parts per million, and they indicated that no more nitrogen was needed. But it did make a mistake quite often, about a third of the time, and the test was below 25 parts per million, which said nitrogen was needed, but in reality it actually wasn't. So you have a false positive. You don't need any fertilizer, but it would recommend fertilizer. Only 1% of the time did it make the expensive error and say there was enough nitrogen in the soil, but actually more was needed. So that's where you get a reduction in grain yield. So it's good as a switch It's really not great for telling you how much you need when you're below that 25 parts per million. And this is the old chart that we've used for many years. And you'll notice the yield, corn yield potential only goes up to 180 bushels. And that doesn't really matter because nobody makes recommendations based on yield anymore, because they've found that there's no good relationship between how much nitrogen you have to add and the yield achieved. And so in Indiana and here in Ohio, we have the MRTN approach, where we have research recommendations based on research results. So Northeast Indiana, with $3.50 corn and $240 UAN, we'd suggest you need about 220 pounds of nitrogen to maximize profit. And if you want to use the PSNT results to adjust that, this is what they come out to based on previous research. So we've just taken that old chart, taken out the yield potential part of it, and looked at the changes in recommendations. So if you're below 10 part per million nitrate nitrogen, we'd suggest the full rate between 11 and 15, reduction in 30 pounds per acre, 16 to 20 reduction of 45, 21 to 25 part per million recommendation of 90 less than 220, so 130, and then above 25, no side dress N. So if you use the old PSNT recommendations, they're the same in Ohio, and you want to take out the yield potential component, these are the adjustments that would be made. The other thing that we found to be useful, of course not to make adjustments during the growing season, but to get a feel for the availability coefficients and the program in general, how well it's taking advantage of the nitrogen, is this end of season corn stalk nitrate test, where you begin about 6 inches above the soil surface and take an 8-inch segment out of the stalk. Initially, the research had been done to show to take samples 2 to 3 weeks after black layer. And then people that were raising silage were interested in going earlier, and Penn State did a lot of research that showed that the results were the same whether you were a quarter milk line, which is a couple weeks before black layer, up to 3 weeks after black layer. So they expanded this sampling zone to go earlier in the year, which is great for silage. It's also more pleasant, I think, to be out there at that time taking samples, and you don't have to worry about the combine eating you up either. So the test is misinterpreted a lot. It's really useful for identifying adequate to excessive N, but it's not very helpful to tell you if you're deficient in nitrogen, and I'll show you why. We have a pretty recent update on this, and then Purdue has, Sylvie Bruder has another publication that's very helpful if you want to do corn stalk nitrate testing. I'm going to show you some data that we got from our strip trials and on-farm tests in assessing the end of season corn stalk nitrate test. All right, just a little bit on why it works. On the top here, we have a nitrogen trial, and we reported the grain yield in bushels per acre. We had something about 35 pounds of nitrogen, about 90, all the way up to a little over 250. And the yield went up sharply from 35 to 100 and topped out somewhere here between 100 and 130. So we've maximized yield. And then we measured corn stalk nitrate associated with that yield. And you see here these first 2 points before we reach maximum yield have almost no nitrate in the stalk. So the plant is deficient in nitrogen, and it removes all that nitrate from the stalk, uses it to make protein. That protein is transferred to the grain to make yield. Once you attain maximum yield, the plant still takes up nitrogen and it stores it in the stalk tissue. So you see that the levels begin to accumulate in the stalk, and they just continue to go up as we added more nitrogen, but didn't influence yield. So looking at this stalk nitrate level is a good indicator of when adequate, maximum yield has been attained, and then the higher levels are associated with excessive availabilities of nitrogen. So this is a bunch of data. There's a lot of different symbols and colors that just represents experiments. I think there was about 50 experiments that we used to develop this relationship. And you see here is relative yield as a percentage of predicted maximum yield. So we did a nitrogen response curve for yield for each experiment, and we took each individual plot and we looked at the relative yield of that plot and the stalk nitrate associated with plants taken from that plot. And remember earlier I said it's not good at telling you that the corn is deficient. So here at low levels below 250 parts per million, yield goes from anywhere from 20% to over 100%. So there are plants that reach maximum yield that have utilized every bit of nitrogen that's in their stalk tissue. And then there's plants that are terribly deficient that only made a fifth of maximum yield, and they've used everything that's in that stalk tissue as well. So there's really no information to be gained here at the low levels. But once it begins to accumulate in the stalk, above 250 parts per million, you're more and more likely to be at maximum yield. You see here almost every value is above 80% of maximum yield. Here it's above 90, and once we get above 4,000 parts per million, all of those are clustered around 100% of maximum yield. So these levels are pretty sensitive, and I'll show you in a slide or two. Once that nitrogen goes above the optimum, the plant accumulates nitrate pretty rapidly. So we found from analyzing our data that once you get above 4,000 parts per million, you're more than 30 or 40 pounds per acre above what's necessary. So it's definitely an excessive level. When you get below that, then you're talking about 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 pounds per acre above the optimum, and that's yearly variability. You can easily have 30 or 40 pounds too less one year and 30 or 40 pounds too much the next year and be doing a good job. But I'd say once you get above 4,000 parts per million, your nitrogen program is providing too much nitrogen, and you ought to consider making modifications. This just illustrates the excess, and you see at these above 4,000, you're starting to get 50 and 100 and 150 pounds too much nitrogen provided to those plants. And we do see levels up around 15 and 15,000 parts per million, which is 1.5%, which is higher than the concentration of nitrogen in the grain at the end of the season. So the plant will continue to accumulate that nitrogen to pretty excessive levels. Just to illustrate here, above 4,000, you're getting into areas where it's obviously too much nitrogen. Summary, nitrogen availability is very difficult to predict. Even with fertilizer, it is infinitely more difficult when animal manure, because there's so many factors that affect that availability. Availability coefficients are just that, just estimates. and the true variability varies from year to year. So I don't believe there's any way to accurately predict nitrogen availability, and you have to do something to check on that availability. The earlier the manures put out, the more uncertain the availability. So trying to move manure applications into in-season, as I heard you had a talk this morning about side dressing with manure, or shortly before the season, really helps in estimating that availability. But even so, you really do need some methods for testing availability, and the most tested that we have is the PSNT, measuring soil nitrate early in the cropping season. I think the end of season corn stalk sampling is helpful in assessing the manure application program, and people ought to consider doing that every year on a few fields to get a feel for where they are in the nitrogen program, if they're excessive or whether they're kind of in the ballpark with their application.